here to the Prosser Hall in the Borough Building of Camp Hill. This is the usual hangout for the Historical Society of Camp Hill. We're fortunate to have this. If any of you live in the borough or have heard rumors about the borough, there is no land available. You have to pay about $150 million just to get a little lot. So we're fortunate to be here. So I want to welcome Historic Harrisburg. This will be the second program that we've had with them. The first one was strictly on the businesses of downtown Harrisburg, and surprisingly many of the management people and even a lot of the worker bees lived in Camp Hill. So we have quite an arrangement. But anyway, again, I want to welcome you. I just might warn you, all of our events normally start at 6:30. So if any of our members who are ingrained habit of 6:30 happen to wander in, that's who those strange faces will be. So the outline is this: words of welcome, which I gave you, welcome. Next, we're going to pledge allegiance to the flag, and then I will introduce, where'd he go? Oh, there he is, from Historic Harrisburg, David Morrison. So if you are able, please join me and rise, and we'll pledge allegiance to our flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Where do you go? Yeah, he stays in place. David?
Okay. Thank you very much, Wayne Yost, president of Camp Hill Historical Society. Or is it Historical Society of Camp Hill? HSCH. Wonderful. Great. Well, thank you very much. And I see this is a wonderful blend of East Shore and West Shore and of Historic Harrisburg faces and Camp Hill Historical Society faces. So let's take a little bit of a poll. How many people are here either as members or because you regularly come to Camp Curtin Historical or Camp Hill Historical Society events? Okay. How many are more likely here because of Historic Harrisburg programming? Okay. How many are here because you're involved in both of those organizations in some way or another? Well, a handful of you. Great, super, fantastic. The idea of having our events at various locations is fairly recent, but the idea of trying to do something here at Camp Hill goes way back, and I have to give the credit to our longtime member, Diane Beeble, sitting here in the front row, worked with us at Historic Harrisburg many years ago, and still is giving me good advice and good ideas. So, and this is one of them. So thank you, Diane. I want to acknowledge the Historic Harrisburg Education Committee, which is responsible for lining up our programs and presenting them to you free of charge, and chaired by Dr. Dorothy King, standing in the back. Hi, Dorothy. Thank you so much for the great job you and your committee do. I want to then mention, the upcoming events which Dorothy's committee is responsible for. Perhaps you picked up this schedule of events, but that is our schedule of upcoming events through the end of the year. We typically have our education programs on the fourth Monday of the month, fourth Monday at 6 o'clock. And mostly at our building, Historic Harrisburg Resource Center at 3rd and Verbeck in Midtown Harrisburg, but like today, we occasionally are elsewhere. You'll see also that we have coming up October 12th, a walking tour of Old Uptown Harrisburg. And we do these walking tours typically on Saturday morning from 10 to 12. And if you're a member of Historic Harrisburg, you save $5. I guess that's a good point for me to say that our membership brochure is on the table there. I've already gotten one new application tonight. Thank you very much, Judith Patton. You are a wonderful promoter so many historical activities in the capital region, and you were great to be a member as well. And I should also mention Camp Hill Historical Society's membership for those of you that are Harrisburgers that want to consider dual membership. The next big thing we have coming up is this, our next month's fourth Monday, on Monday, October 28th. It's called Neighborhood Preservation, Historic Districts, and Community Building, and that's at our building. I guess that would actually be 5 weeks from tonight. And then, this is something new, a dog walkers tour of historic Midtown. The first time we've ever had a bring your dog on the tour, Saturday morning walking tour. So, and dogs can come for free, and they can even be dogs from Camp Hill. So bring your dog and have an interesting walk through the beautiful urban streets of Midtown, Harrisburg, and Riverfront Park. And lastly, this postcard is for Elegant Progressions, our annual progressive dinner, which is the first weekend in December. This is now in its 27th year. It's a wonderful gala black tie event. And we're going to be at 3 West Shore properties this year, so it'll be very easy for many of you who live in this area, this side of the river, to join us if you wish. So grab as much of that literature as you want. Feel free to be in touch with us. Our website and email addresses are listed, and we'd love to see more of you. So thank you again for being here tonight. What a wonderful turnout. Now let me introduce our speaker tonight. Bryan Van Sweden is with the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission's State Bureau for Historic Preservation. So that's the state office that we deal with a lot. And I've known Bryan for close to 40 years. We both have been in this business most of our careers. He is now the Community Preservation Coordinator and Advisor for the Central Pennsylvania area. So he works very closely with Historic Harrisburg, with Historic York, with any of the organizations that need help. I must say that the state is very helpful in that regard. His office and his colleagues are wonderful, and we couldn't accomplish all that we do without the support of the State Bureau of Historic Preservation Office. He's a historic preservation tactician, but he is also a very accomplished architectural historian, meaning he knows a lot about old buildings, and that's really why he's here tonight, to tell you something that you may not know about some of the houses right here in your own backyard, the bungalows of Camp Hill. So without further ado, please welcome Bryan Van Sweden.
Thank you, David. Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to speak here, just a couple blocks away from my own house. So that's always a nice treat. Usually I'm traveling off to someplace to say something. So I wanted to, a lot of this is going to be focused on kind of the architecture. What's the architecture about? What does it tell us? But I'd like to start, because I also am a historian, I want to talk about kind of where this fits, where this architecture fits in the context of history. And this is kind of be a kind of remedial history for those of you who know this, but I just want to kind of make sure that we kind of cover it. And that is that, we always talk about the West Shore as being kind of these communities that have been here for so long. You got to remember that the West Shore started out as just some small villages, small towns. New Cumberland was you can see is a little bit developed. Wormleysburg is there. Lemoyne doesn't even show up. Camp Hill is still called White Hill at that point. So this is very early on, and really these are just little kind of rural villages at the time, outskirts, far on the outskirts of the city of Harrisburg. But then along came the streetcars, and around the turn of the century, they started developing streetcar lines that ran from Harrisburg out to all of the boroughs here in the West Shore, and that's really the heyday of these boroughs. All of them developed you look around, you drive down the streets and there's a nice grid pattern where just a few blocks on either side of Market Street here in Camp Hill and in Lemoyne and on Bridge Street in New Cumberland, you find all these houses that date from that period, the early 20th century. And so it's kind of a perfect little petri dish for looking at the architecture of early 20th century Pennsylvania. So one thing I just wanted to define the bungalow, for those of you who aren't kind of up on the terminology. The bungalow, architectural historians argue whether or not it's a style or whether it's a form, but in any event, the most typical form of the bungalow that we, when we define a bungalow, is that it's usually a 1.5-story house with a full front, a big porch across the front, and a single dormer coming out the front. That's kind of the very baseline. We'll talk a lot about some of the details and what kind of other details you find on these bungalows. But I wanted to get started with just that idea, that a picture in your head of what we're talking about when we talk about bungalows. So you may have noticed in the title slide, it talked about arts and crafts bungalows. The one thing that a lot of architectural historians do is they group bungalows under the heading of arts and crafts architecture. Arts and crafts architecture was popularized in the early 20th century by a number of different people, including Gustav Stigli, Albert Hubbard. All these people were talking about the arts and crafts movement was a bigger thing. It was kind of a rejection of the machine-made, manufactured Victorian, both the decorative arts and the architecture. All the kind of gingerbread, as we often call it, little sawn details, little turn details. That was seen to be kind of passé, and they wanted to get back to something that looked nice and handmade, something simple, handmade, straightforward, no frills. And the arts and crafts movement was the bigger kind of movement that got people interested in that, and the architecture began to reflect that new taste in design. Oh, I see.
The other way.
I'm using a mouse, so I was thinking that. Okay, there we go. All right. So the kind of the characteristics of arts and crafts architecture, and I like to call it easy living in a natural setting, where if you go into a Victorian house, everything's very kind of formal, and it's got kind of a little bit of a. It was kind of seen as a little stuffy. So this was kind of the new American architecture. This was architecture that was designed to be kind of the way people were really living. And what they wanted to do, the arts and crafts idea came in that they were using traditional materials and building methods. So you'll see lots of natural stone, natural woodwork, brick, tile, stucco, all those things that can be handmade, even though they often were machine-made, to be honest. But a lot of them were handmade materials, are designed to look handmade. And so the details and the features were all kind of rustic or very simple in any event. And informal floor plans, again, there wasn't like these kind of grand entrances like you had in Georgian houses where you entered into a center hallway to kind of be introduced. You didn't have the formal parlors that you would find in a Victorian house. So these are a lot more kind of casual, more family-oriented places. And of course, porches. I talked already about the front porch as being kind of one of the main features of the bungalow, and this was common throughout arts and crafts architecture. That was that kind of indoor-outdoor living where you are able to enjoy nature, enjoy the fresh air. That was really important. So one thing that I often do when I'm looking at architecture is I try to figure out, well, where did this come from? I talked about what that form looks like. Well, did it just appear out of nowhere? In my kind of studies, I've looked at something, an earlier style, a style started in the late 1800s called the shingle style. And the shingle style was often got popularized along the East Coast in kind of seaside communities. And it featured lots of wood shingles on everything. So again, it had that kind of rustic feel, and you all heard, seen houses from Nantucket or Martha's Vineyard or something like that. These they have that same kind of rustic feel, simple feel, and a lot of them were this 1.5 story form. And a lot of them, because they wanted to use that upper story, they had these dormers. So I kind of surmise, and a few people have backed me up on this, and that is that that what we think of as the bungalow form, the bungalow style, kind of had its initial birth in the shingle style. That's where that idea of that floor plan, of that format came from. And that was I think you'll start to see that, I think, in around this time. So a lot of these buildings were, around the turn of the century. Bungalows came just slightly later, and but I think that they held on to that form. When we talk about bungalows across the country, the kind of the eastern bungalows kind of stand out a little bit. They don't look the same as a bungalow you might find in Chicago or in California. Those had different influences from other architects, other kind of architectural influences. So I think this is kind of where the eastern bungalow, if you will, got its idea. When I first did a presentation like this, I went around and took a bunch of pictures of bungalows on the West Shore, and I realized that there was kind of some differences. You could almost see kind of the progression of how the bungalow style changed over those years. So I kind of broke it down into the ones from the early years, ones from the heyday, as I call it, and then there was kind of a transition where the bungalow form kind of continued, but it started to morph into something a little bit more like what you see in the post-war period with the ranch. And the reason I talk about this, and this is true of pretty much every architectural style. Architectural styles, they come about when famous architects start designing them. They show up in architectural magazines. Maybe contractors start seeing them and saying, "Oh, I want to try to do that." And they imitate that. They want to seem, up to date, up to style. So the ones at the beginning are always the ones that are kind of really quintessential examples. They have all the right features, all the right things, and they're just kind of, if you're going to look for the best examples, they're often the earliest examples. During the heyday, which we'll get into, the bungalow becomes kind of almost standard. It becomes so common that all the builders are doing it, and so you start to, while it still has the same kind of form and stuff, some of the features start to get a little even more simplified and a little bit more standardized. And so we'll look at a bunch of examples of that, and again, the transition later on, we'll talk a little bit about that too. So these are some of the trendsetters that I see, and I did enough research to get a few of the dates on these to kind of confirm my suspicions. So you see some early examples here where they use very, they got that arts and crafts feel. They got the big porches. They got exposed structural details. They're made of stone, stucco, those kinds of things. They got the dormers. So these are the buildings that kind of reflect that arts and crafts feel, that arts and crafts kind of influence. And from 1912, 1920, and oh, by the way, I have to confess to those in the Camp Hill Historic Society, I didn't only take pictures of buildings in Camp Hill, so there are a few others in here. And if I remember right, I think the one on the bottom there is from New Cumberland. Some other trendsetters. I talked a lot about how the gable kind of slopes down over the porch in kind of the typical example. But another example you often find are these examples where the gable, the peak, faces the street. And that's another variation on the theme. Still, again, 1.5 stories, your porch, you've got nice simple columns and stuff, details, little, again, structural details kind of called out. I believe this is wood shingles on the front of that. So again, hits all those right notes, and is a good example of that kind of alternative form of the bungalow, kind of a cottage. Another example here from New Cumberland, right there on Bridge Street. And this one, although it's been altered somewhat, you can see a lot of the kind of very heavy, kind of structural looking details of the brackets that hold up the broad overhanging eaves. Here, especially on the front, the front porch has been enclosed in this case, but you can still see that it had lots of windows, lots of dormers, that kind of very informal feel to it. Some additional examples. Here's a more typical one with a brick on the first floor and wood shingle on the top. Another thing that you find in a lot of arts and crafts houses are these particular windows which have vertical panes in the upper sash and one large pane in the lower sash. A lot of those have gotten replaced over the years, but it is pretty typical of bungalows and the buildings at the same time period. But another good example, you can see how when I was talking about those structural details kind of being exposed, you got what they call the rafter tails. The ends of the rafters are left exposed instead of being closed up inside of a soffit. And then you have these little knee braces to kind of help support that, again, that broad overhanging eave. Showed a couple of other alternative examples. Here's one that's got a dormer and then it's got a little secondary dormer. This one is in Camp Hill here. That one is, again, still kind of, they're reflecting the influence of that arts and crafts, not quite standardized yet at this point. And then we've talked a lot about houses with gable roofs, but that doesn't mean that you can't do a bungalow form using a hipped roof. In this example here, it's got a hipped roof over the porch, and then it's got a hipped roof dormer in the center. So you've got that same kind of feel, and this is a particularly good example with these really big, heavy square posts. It's very typical of porch posts, and then they always sat on some sort of masonry base. You can see that in all these examples. If you think of like a Victorian house, quite often the posts raised from the floor all the way up, and they're quite often turned. Well, these are, again, a radical difference in kind of that appearance. A couple more. In this case, instead of having a gable or a hipped roof dormer, these have what we call a shed roof dormer, just a single slope. And what I find about this one is that it really reflects another big change in the way arts and crafts architecture, especially bungalows, kind of was a transition or a reaction to Victorian architecture. Victorian architecture was very vertical. It was, very tall and tall ceilings, tall windows, narrow windows. Everything was very vertical. In these examples, you can see how the bungalow had this concept of kind of being much more horizontal and kind of flattening out and spreading out. It makes it look like it's more spread out, more relaxed. And these are some particularly good examples with the shed roof dormers. And full confession, this is my house here.
That's very nice. That's my house.
So, I got one. Good. So in the heyday, which again starts roughly in the 1920s, then we start to see a little bit more of a standardization, and the houses become a little bit more. You start seeing them kind of more commonly. They're not kind of the unique examples anymore. Now they're starting to be the common examples. So again, some hipped roof examples here. Again, full front porches. Nice brick columns here. Square wood columns. Again, they've got brick. What's the right word? The bases on these. And I think in some of these examples, you can see that they have the typical kind of windows. One thing that you often see, again, in the idea of bringing lots of light in, is that they group these windows together. So you'll often see multiple windows, in porches and in the main room, in the living room, and then of course you do see plenty of bay windows still around, because those are good. Again, are really good for bringing in a lot of light. And these are, of course, these are the kind of the cream of the crop in terms of being that typical example with the long sloping roof coming down front, with the gable dormers, full front porches. Here you get these, we call them battered porch posts. They kind of slope very drastically, but they look really solid, and that's exactly the whole point of what the builders were trying to achieve. And again, these groups of windows, especially in the dormers, you'll see these groups of windows that provide lots and lots of light to the interior without kind of creating the picture window effect that we might think of today. And often used in multiple panes. Yes?
Do you think the majority of these bungalows came from the Sears catalog?
I think the Sears catalog, it's always a little difficult because the Sears catalog essentially reflected something that was very popular. So it's, sometimes you can find them, in a catalog and say, that's exactly, my house. But I think in a lot of cases, there's not a lot of difference between one that may have been built, by a contractor right there on site and one that was shipped in. But yes, there are a lot, the Sears and Aladdin and some of those other companies that sold kits for these houses. The bungalow was very popular. You just have to kind of, if you take a, if you go back and find some of the catalogs and look, you may be able to find one that looks a lot like yours. But again, the floor plans weren't that much different than what we were normally built. A lot of builders were building anyway. So sometimes I think it's a little bit hard to spot them. But
does a bungalow have to also be a single family home, or were there also bungalow duplexes?
good question. Maybe that'll show up later in the presentation.
Because I'm thinking of a couple in Camp Hill.
Here's a good examples of how these bungalows started to become really popular. You started to see situations where a builder may have bought a bunch of lots and started building bungalows and bungalows. So you see, in this case, they're varied somewhat. In other cases, they're very similar but all kind of lined up in this nice little row, but all having those same kinds of typical bungalow features. And these are all built, again, right in the middle of the 20s. This one a little bit later in the early 1930s, but all during that heyday of bungalows. This is Camp Hill. I think this is Lemoyne, if I remember right. This is New Cumberland. And a couple of other examples. This one, I always drive by these and think, oh, that's such a great example. And that's of course right here in 23rd, just blocks away. Again, those battered posts, as we talked about, exposed rafter tails, has all those typical details. Here's one with yet another variation on the roof line, but still creating that same effect. In this case, it's, if you really want to know, it's called a jerkin head, or a clipped gable. It's basically a gable roof, but it's got this little hip section. So it's another variation on the theme. But again, some of these are starting to they're getting to that point of, we often think of bungalows as being small houses. Well, now they're starting to, they really are starting to be the kind of small house that your average worker family, working class family would be able to afford. So, now, to your question, yes, there are some examples. This row in Lemoyne is a particularly good example where they used the bungalow form in obviously built all as one big grouping by a developer, but these are, I think a lot of these are duplexes. They'll have the porch be shared, and then the dormers are also kind of split down the middle, so that you've got still have one dormer, but it serves two different houses. But still, you see they again, you can see how they're kind of simplifying things, especially for kind of mass construction, where you've got in this case they're using a molded cast stone, they call it, or concrete block that's made to look like stone, but that's a much simpler thing, obviously, than using real stone, but it still creates the same effect. And then, of course, there's another wonderful example of bungalow development, so to speak, residential development right here on South 31st Street here in Camp Hill. And again, you can just, they're always fun to look at because they line up so nicely. All those porches all line up and all the dormers line up. And in many cases, again, these tend to be a little more simple. They're brick houses, got square posts, nothing terribly fancy, but perfect example of how developers found that these bungalows were kind of the ideal thing for kind of that mass construction. And this is fun to look at because these show up on like aerial photographs. You can see the nice little row of all the houses there from I forget what, this is from the aerial photographs that were taken, I forget which year this was. I think this was in the 1930s. And then I spotted on Camp Hill Historical Society's website this nice aerial photograph by S.W. Crooner from circa 1940, and you can see again how these are showing up. These are brand new. There's still open land still around them. This was the development. This was suburbia back in around 1940. You can still even see the remnants of the quarry back there. And here's an example from New Cumberland. This is on 15th Street, kind of leading down away from Bridge Street towards the river. So unless you make a point of going down there, you may never have spotted these. But a really nice row of bungalows, all built about the same time. And again, you can see them showing up in these aerial photographs. It's a good way to kind of spot these development kind of things. But very simple, straightforward examples with the gable roofs and the gable dormers and porch posts. These are all brick with frame on the upper stories. So I mentioned briefly, California was another place where a lot of arts and crafts architecture was being built, and certainly bungalows. And the bungalows there were kind of over the top compared to what we often see in Pennsylvania. But one of the things that the bungalows there were coming out of was the tradition of ranch houses, which was originally going way back to Spanish influences, where you actually had one-story living. It was the ideal kind of living in a real hot climate where you wanted to spread out rather than having a lot of heat building up on the upper floor. So this idea of kind of going to a complete one-story living is something that's kind of a West Coast idea, or at least it was popularized out there, and then bungalows kind of adapted to that. So you start seeing bungalows that are essentially one-story houses, or at least are focused mostly on one story, and they tend to, instead of being kind of those narrow buildings going back into the lot, they start to spread out a little bit more. But you still see the same kinds of features. In fact, you still see the same kinds of windows. It was built in 1950, and they're still using those kind of arts and craftsman style windows. Here you start to see kind of picture windows starting to show up in these kinds of houses. Still have a nice big porch and then front-facing gable, but they're starting to feel a little bit more California, a little bit more of that. What we're going to be coming, you start to see the ranch houses that start to kind of become more typical in the years after World War II. So, I'll be happy to take any questions. I already had some good ones. Yes?
I was intrigued by one of the pictures within the heyday of the bungalow style. One of them looked a lot like the house where I grew up in Lancaster County. Except that house was 2 full stories and the dormer roof was like a 2.5 story. But apparently that's the 4-square style that came out of the prairie style. But it looked a lot like that one, the same layout and everything.
Yeah, I did. Since I was talking about bungalows, I kind of stuck to bungalows. But the bungalows have kind of a bigger brother, so to speak, or a bigger cousin, maybe it should be. What they call the American 4-square. And they use almost exactly the same architectural details and features that you find in a bungalow. But instead of being 1.5 stories, they're 2.5 stories. And they're almost always square or rectangular in shape, and they have a hipped roof instead of a gable roof. But they too always have that center dormer. So, you know, and of course the full front porch. So they in almost every way, they are like bungalows, but I was kind of sticking to the 1.5 story. But yes, 4 squares are a good example. They came out of a couple of different influences, both, as you mentioned, the prairie style, but I think too it was kind of the late Victorian period where, you know, 2-story houses were much more common and you know, provide a lot more space. In fact, I always found it interesting. My grandparents owned a bungalow, and it was interesting to me that when they bought the house, there was really nothing on in the you know, that half story, the attic space. It was, you know, an empty space, and they were the ones who converted it to bedrooms. And I found that the story is very similar in my own house. That the stories, it's got 2 bedrooms on the first floor, and the stories were that the kids played up in that upper story. You know, it was kind of a bonus space in the old days, and it was only converted to a bedroom much later on. So I think that a lot of times that's, you know, you sometimes hear about these, you know, these houses nowadays are built with kind of the idea that, you know, you can fix it up and finish it later, you know, as you got the money. I think a lot of bungalows are probably sold that way too. You know, they were designed for growing families. You might be able to move in as a couple, and there might be a bedroom on the first floor, and as you got kids, then you finish off that upper story and move the kids upstairs to sweat in the summertime. Yeah.
Kind of on that same line, that I'm guessing that when the roof line comes down to the top of the first floor, that's a key aspect of this,
Sure.
Of the bungalow feature. But I noticed on some of the ones that you had, the roof was very tall, and in addition to dormers on the roof and then windows on the side, you know, under the gables, I guess you would say, for the second floor, what appeared to be a substantial second floor with probably numerous rooms. In some cases, there was even a window that would have been a 3rd level, but still with a roof coming all the way down as this one does. So,
Right.
I guess.
Yeah, and I think I think again, yeah, a lot of them, some of them, I mean, there would still be room for attic space above the ceiling on that second level, depending on the size of the bungalow. Some of them have, you know, they have sloped
for the 2
ceilings.
walls to meet, they're going to get pretty high.
Yeah, right.
Openings.
And I think that's one of the reasons why I think that a lot of eastern ones come out of that kind of the shingle style, because those did have higher pitched roofs. They were coming out of the Victorian tradition, where you had you provide a lot more headroom, so to speak, on that upper level. So that's why I say when I see some of these where they got a lower pitched roof, it's got kind of that characteristic kind of, whether you call it prairie style or California style, they're kind of aiming at that low, sleek look. But you're right, there are some that are, it's, you know, that upper story is pretty big. Yes?
I live in Midtown Harrisburg in a city row house. It does not look like any other of the row houses because it was built in 1906.
Oh, okay.
But I think the inside though would be considered arts and craft or craftsman, because it has a lot of those oak features, like the oak fireplace and the cabinets, and like, so that style wasn't only for bungalows. It was influenced in other types of architecture too.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about, you know, houses that are being built now, I mean, people mix and match, you know, features that they like. And during the early 20th century, obviously, the details, the arts and crafts features were popular. In fact, a lot of times when you go in, you know, you go, as you mentioned, I mean, the details like the typical kind of trim that you see over doors and windows inside a bungalow, you find them in 4 squares, you find them in colonial revival houses, you find them in Tudor revival houses. I mean, it just became so standardized, and it was kind of what everybody was expecting on the interior for the trim. So I think that, yeah, there's a lot of those features that show up, and you know, in kind of a longer version of kind of where bungalows come from, I talk about that arts and crafts influence and how it relates to that kind of looking back to kind of medieval architecture, like the Tudor revival. So a lot of times that all that kind of stained woodwork and the heavy beams and that sort of thing, it all fits the same kind of design ethic. So you see it in all sorts of styles, and they have that similar kind of feel. And again, it was a movement. So it was, you know, it wasn't like they were saying, oh, you can't put that trim in that house because it's a bungalow, or it's not a bungalow. And you know, if they like the trim, they like the trim. And you know, the idea of these the fireplaces, certainly fireplaces were very popular in the early 20th century. Pretty much every house, you know, every bigger house would have a fireplace of some sort. And in the kind of the classic bungalow style, where you know, you have a fireplace with either windows on either side of the fireplace, or built-in bookcases or something like that. That's something that's just, you know, fits the lifestyle, you know, and you do see a lot of it in houses that range widely. The house that we lived in before we lived in the house here in Camp Hill, we lived in New Cumberland, and that house had a gambrel roof, which is kind of like a barn roof, you know, and two slopes. But essentially, it was, you know, for all intents and purposes, it was a bungalow. You know, everything else, you know, the porch posts were just like a bungalow's. Like you say, the trim on the interior is almost all typical bungalow, but it didn't have that typical form on the outside, other than, you know, essentially it just provided more height in addition to your dormer. Yes?
Was there a standardized floor plan for these structures? For example, was the access to the second floor always a staircase in the center or on the side of the house?
Yeah, that's one thing that you'll often see, and that's one thing that does differ from like a four-square. In a four-square house, a two-story house, the stairway is almost always right in the front hall. You walk in the front door, and there's often a winding, you know, a switchback stairway right there in front of you, or even a straight up stairway. A lot of times in bungalows, yeah, the stairs were a little bit more hidden, or they were tucked to the side, kind of between the rooms or something like that. So there were several kind of standard floor plans. They weren't all the same. Some of them were kind of had two rooms. Basically, the house is 2 rooms wide, so everything lines up in two ways back. Others are almost kind of a shotgun shack kind of effect, where you've got basically one room, you know, front to back, kind of more like almost like a row house. It depended kind of on a lot of those different things. The four-square was always often designed with 4 essentially square rooms, you know, at each corner. And so you'll see some bungalows that have that floor plan as well. It all kind of depends on you know, the size of the bungalow and obviously the kind of the preferences. But so I think in a lot of cases bungalows would have at least 1 bedroom on the first floor. But you know, they probably don't all that way. But I know the one thing I remember seeing, and this is another example of kind of how the interior interior trim of bungalows shows up in a lot of things. You know those kind of Spanish-looking houses on which
Center Street.
Yeah, right. We were in one of those one time, and that had a kind of a largely bungalow floor plan and bungalow trim on the inside. In that case, it was designed. As I recall, I think all the bedrooms were lined up on one side, and then the living room, dining room, and the kitchen were on the other side. So you had this kind of, again, two rooms wide all the way back, and where in that case they had all the bedrooms on the first floor. So I think it varied. That was another thing that makes me suspect that the second floor wasn't always really a major bedroom floor right from the start. the stairway in our house, the only way that, when the house was first built, the only way to get up to the attic space or the second story was to walk through the bathroom, and there was a door in the bathroom. Well, it's still there. You had to go through the bathroom to go up to the upstairs. Later on, they opened another opening on the other side of the stairway so that you can get up from, without having to go through the bathroom to get upstairs. But, so obviously it varied. Sometimes the stairway was kind of a visual feature, sometimes it was essentially a hidden feature. Yes?
I've been in the borough since 1961, and I've noticed one thing about many of the homes. There's additions behind them. They've built additions to them. Most of them you can't see because they are behind them.
Right.
But occasionally you'll find one that expands on the sides. If you don't before you walk around town, just look a little bit and you'll see most of the has an addition.
Yeah, and bungalows, especially a lot of the standard bungalows, they would have a full front porch, and they would have either a full or a half porch in the back. And whenever people needed more room, that was always the first thing to go, was that back porch. So they'd just close it up and make it into, expand the kitchen, or make it into a bathroom, or make it into a hallway, into a bigger addition in the back. Yes?
Early on, you spoke about how we transitioned from the Victorian gingerbread into
Right.
the bungalow type style home. What was going on in the universe at that time, more or less, to influence that change? And was that mostly here or just everywhere?
Yeah, when I decided not to do the long version of this, the American arts and crafts movement came out of the English arts and crafts movement, which started even earlier yet. That started in the 1860s or 1870s. And that was even more so a rejection of kind of modern at the time, architecture and that sort of thing, and trying to recapture, in that case, they were trying to recapture their medieval past. So it took on this kind of, it was rustic in a very stylish way, so to speak. And so, but it was very much so. I mean, you think of people like William Morris and Rennie McIntosh. These were all architects and or design influencers of their day who were promoting going back to simpler things. And here in the U.S., the movement became such that you actually had these arts and crafts communities would develop, where people would come and live in a community, and they would each kind of pick up their craft. They'd be doing metalworking, or they'd be doing leatherworking, or they'd be printing books, or they'd be doing stone carving, or they each have different crafts, and so it fit right into the whole idea was that they would have this arts and crafts architecture. There's a couple of really good examples. I mentioned Albert Hubbard. He was in East Aurora, New York. That community still maintains a lot of its kind of arts and crafts. In fact, they still have kind of an association there. Another one here in Pennsylvania is called Rose Valley. It's in Delaware County, which was, again, another arts and crafts community, very intentional community where a lot of people, often architects and other crafts people, would get together and kind of create these they're almost like communes. They were almost, they would do a lot of community events and that sort of thing around. It's kind of almost, it was all, you were asking about kind of the universal thing. A lot of this, I think, was also coming about at the same time as kind of the kind of reformist idea of, rebelling against big corporations and kind of the excesses of capitalism. And so they were again intentionally looking at producers, people producing things themselves, not producing for a bigger company, not being kind of at the whim of a factory worker, that kind of thing. So it was a social movement as much as it was a design movement. That was probably more than you were looking for, but. Yes?
One of my favorite features in bungalows was something that would divide the living room and dining room. It would be like two little shelves on each
Yeah.
side with one post
Yeah.
going to the ceiling. I love them. I wish they still put them in houses.
Yeah, it was again, in some respects, bungalows were kind of what we still think of as kind of high living. You watch HGTV and they're always talking about these open concepts, and basically a lot of times they're taking out things that may have been done in the post-war period to create those bigger openings, so that you had more space and kind of more visual character, so you could be able to see from one room to another. And that was a perfect screen, a way to subdivide the floor plan without really creating a wall, full wall. Yeah, our house has that too.
They're pretty.
Yeah. Another great place for them to show off their kind of woodwork and that sort of thing, natural woodwork and that kind of solid structural look.
Yeah.
Any other questions for Bryan? Thank you very much. We'll definitely look for more opportunities to have our two organizations collaborate in one way or another, whether it's for programs in this room or programs over at Third and Burbeck, or maybe programs out on the sidewalk. Whatever appeals. But thank you all for your interest. Wayne, you have a comment?
There's still snacks left. Socialize for 10 minutes.
Thank you, yes indeed. Thank you all for coming. You have questions for Bryan, questions for Camp Hill?